I always knew the hive would take more from me than I ever had to give, but nothing prepared me for the first morning. I climbed down into its throat and felt the waist-thick air press against my chest like a hand that already knew the shape of my final breath. For as soon as the hatch clanged shut above me and the faint light disappeared, I realized with a quiet dread that the darkness down there was not empty but watching, crowding close like a creature that had been waiting for me since birth. And in that suffocating stillness, before I took another step, the thought rose unbidden and trembling through me. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end, because even in those first moments, the hive's filth seemed to whisper my name with a familiarity the living world had never granted me. I walked forward with my lamp clenched tight in my trembling hands, its dim beam slicing the dark in a narrow blade of sickly yellow. And the stench, Emperor, the stench, rose around me in warm layers that clung to the inside of my throat, a mixture of rot, chemicals, decay, and something sour beneath it all. Something that made the edges of my vision throb as if my eyes wished to recoil from what lay ahead. But the tunnels had no patience for hesitation. And the metal walkway beneath my boots groaned with a wet ache, slick with grime and swaying slightly, as though something beneath it shifted in slow, unsettling waves. I remember pausing at a junction where 3 tunnels diverged into darkness so complete it felt like staring into open mouths. And as I stood there listening to the distant churn of unseen machinery, the air stirred against my face with the faintest ripple as though something had moved past me in the dark, too close, too quiet. And the lamp flickered in my grip, its dying light catching the glistening surface of the sludge below, revealing faint streaks of a darker color threading through it like veins. And for a moment, the slow churning of that thick, tar-like waste seemed almost purposeful, as though responding to the rhythm of my breathing, as though it recognized the heat of my living body and leaned toward it. I forced myself deeper into the left-hand tunnel, each step sinking slightly into the grime that coated the walkway, and I felt the weight of the hive pressing through the pipes above me. Thousands of tons of waste and machinery and forgotten lives, all vibrating together in a low, mournful hum that resonated in my chest like a heartbeat too slow to be human. And as I followed that sound deeper, the air grew warmer, thicker, pulsing faintly with the exhalations of the hive's endless digestion. And I found myself imagining the hive as a living thing, breathing and swallowing and grinding everything we cast into it. Food scraps, dead vermin, broken augmetics, sometimes bodies, and all of that refuse churned together in the dark currents below the walkway, forming a slow-moving river that seemed to whisper with the voices of those who had fallen into it and been forgotten. A shudder rippled through me as I remembered the stories told by sanitation crews, of workers slipping from rusted catwalks or being dragged down by unseen hands in the muck, their screams muffled by the thick sludge as it swallowed them whole. Their bodies never recovered because the hive simply absorbed them, digesting their flesh into the endless cycle of waste. And though I had once dismissed such tales as nothing more than grim humor shared among exhausted workers, the hiss of the pipes overhead and the slow churn below made it impossible to deny the quiet hunger that lived in these depths. I reached a maintenance alcove where a rusted valve wheel protruded from the wall like a broken limb, and as I knelt to inspect the pressure gauge beside it, A faint vibration traveled up through the metal floor and into my calves. A slow, rhythmic tremor that made me think of something breathing beneath the walkway. Something vast and patient. And the lamp flickered again, its glow dimming as though strained by the darkness, revealing for a heartbeat the faint shape of something drifting just beneath the surface of the sludge. Long, pale, and disturbingly human-shaped, before sinking again with a soft ripple that made the walkway tremble. I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was a trick of the light or some swollen corpse carried along by the current. But the sludge gurgled softly then, as if amused by my denial, and the sound echoed through the tunnel like a small, wet chuckle, and I felt my stomach clench in quiet dread, for I knew the hive would never laugh in a human tongue. Yet the pipes overhead rattled in a rhythm that seemed almost mocking, as if the machinery itself found comfort in my fear. I tightened the valve and signed off the maintenance check on my data slate with trembling fingers, though I could barely focus on the words, for the air had grown heavier still, pressing against my ears as though something monstrous had crawled close behind me, watching the movement of my hands, tasting the quiet panic radiating from my skin. And when I stood and turned, the darkness seemed to recoil just slightly, shifting back like an animal startled by sudden motion. Yet I felt certain it had drawn close enough to breathe against the nape of my neck only moments before. I walked on more quickly now, though speed meant little in the labyrinth of tunnels that twisted endlessly through the hive's bowels, and the faint hum of the machinery grew louder with each step, becoming a low drone that vibrated through my ribs, and beneath that sound was another, softer one, almost a whisper, rising from the sludge below, a murmuring chorus that seemed to grow clearer the deeper I descended, and though I could not make out the words, I felt them seep into the edges of my thoughts like damp creeping into cloth, carrying with them a sorrow so deep it felt ancient, as though the waste itself mourned the countless lives consumed by the hive's hunger. And as I walked through that suffocating dark, with only the dying beam of my lamp to carve a path through the filth, I realized with a tremor that the hive had begun to learn me, my scent, my breath, my quiet fear. And in that first quiet hour of my descent, long before I understood the true horror of these depths, I felt the filth settle around me like a living shroud, whispering promises of what it would one day take from me. From the moment I stepped deeper into the tunnel beyond the maintenance alcove, the air thickened into something so oppressive it felt less like breathing and more like dragging each inhale through a layer of warm, clotted grime. And the stench, by the Emperor, the stench changed from a simple assault on the nose into a presence, a weight, a quiet intelligence that settled against my skin as if testing where I might break first. And with every step I felt it sink deeper, threading into my hair, my clothes, the soft places beneath my ribs, the way grief does when it decides to stay. The lamp in my hand flickered with a nervous tremor, its narrow beam bending across the wet metal walls, which glistened with a slick sheen that shifted in sickly colors, brown to green to a dull red, as though the waste had seeped into the very skin of the hive, staining it with centuries of rot and the unspoken stories of those who had vanished into its throat. And I found myself touching the wall at one point out of instinct, needing to feel something solid. But the metal was warm, almost feverishly so, as though a pulse ran just beneath the surface. And when I yanked my hand away, my palm tingled with a faint burn, as if I had touched something alive rather than a dead, rusted structure. I staggered forward, the walkway growling beneath my boots with each uneven step, and far below the sludge gurgled with a deep, organic sound, thick bubbles rising and bursting in slow, viscous pops that released fresh waves of rancid steam, each one carrying the scent of chemical rot intertwined with something disturbingly reminiscent of spoiled meat. And even though I had been told countless times that bodies sometimes found their way into the waste channels, workers crushed in gears, criminals disposed of in the dark, the forgotten dead swept through the hive's arteries, I never expected the smell to speak so clearly of them, as though the very air were reciting a litany of decomposition for my benefit alone. The corridor bent sharply to the right, and as I followed it, the sound of grinding metal grew louder, a deep mechanical rumble like the growl of a starving beast trapped somewhere in the dark, and the vibration of it traveled through the walkway, up my legs, settling into my spine with each pulse, until it felt as though my bones trembled in sympathy with the hive's ancient, wheezing machinery. I paused at a graded section where the walkway opened into a broader drainage chamber, a cavernous space lit only by the faint red glow of malfunctioning hazard beacons that blinked at uneven intervals, casting long shadows that swayed like bodies suspended from unseen hooks. And beneath the grate, the sludge pooled in a wide basin, its surface shifting with slow currents. And in the dim red light, I saw shapes drifting just beneath, limbs or roots, or coils of industrial waste twisted into forms that hinted at something once living, but long since surrendered to decay. As I crouched to examine the grate, a gust of warm air rose from below, thick with moisture and the reek of deep rot, and the steam curled around my face with a kind of lazy sentience, brushing against my skin as though tasting me, and the instinctive revulsion that shuddered through me seemed to amuse the hive, for a thick bubble burst beneath the grate, spraying a few drops of foul liquid upward to patter against my boots, each droplet releasing a scent so potent it stabbed the back of my throat and forced tears to gather in my eyes. I backed away, wiping at my face with a trembling sleeve, and the world around me swayed faintly, the air shimmering with nausea that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. And for a moment I wondered if the stench itself had become a toxin, something that could seep through my lungs and into my blood, filling me with the hive's slow, patient rot until I became just another soft thing to be digested. Gripping the railing, I stumbled into the next tunnel where the ceiling dipped low enough that condensation dripped steadily onto my shoulders, each drop warm and slick, leaving thin trails down my spine that made my skin crawl as though insects skittered beneath my clothing. And the pipes overhead groaned with a wet, rhythmic pulse that reminded me of a clogged throat struggling to swallow something stubborn. The stench here thickened further, turning sharp and metallic, tinged with the unmistakable scent of rusted blood. And as I moved onward, I felt it anchor itself inside me, settling into the deeper parts of my being. Not just something I smelled, but something I carried, something that imprinted itself onto my senses so profoundly that even blinking did nothing to interrupt its presence, as though it were not in the air around me but in the hollow between breaths. I reached another junction where a flickering terminal cast a faint glow across the tunnel walls, and as I activated it, the screen buzzed and spat static before displaying the maintenance report for this sector, pressure spikes, chemical surges, missing personnel, and each line of text seemed more damning than the last. But one note at the bottom froze me entirely. "Do not linger. Rot displacement reported." And beneath that, the initials of a supervisor I had never met but whose handwriting had a desperate tremble, as if the note had been scrawled during the final moments before something pulled them into the sludge. I shut the terminal off quickly, uneasy with how loudly the machinery hummed behind its casing, as if reacting to my discovery, and when I stepped back from the wall, the stench surged around me like a living thing uncoiling from shadow, pressing against my face with a damp, suffocating closeness that made me gasp for cleaner air that did not exist. And I realized then that the filth in these tunnels did not merely fill space. It occupied it, ruled it, and everything alive in the dark bent beneath its weight. I pressed on, though the air now resisted each movement like a thick, invisible mire. And the more I breathed, the more the hive's rot seemed to settle into my chest. It sent threading through my blood until I could taste it at the back of my tongue, metallic and bitter. And I understood in a quiet, trembling way that the stories the older workers told, the ones who had survived long enough to warn the newer hands, were not just tales to frighten the inexperienced, but confessions. Every sanitation worker in the hive eventually carried the tunnels with them, their sweat, their breath, their dreams all steeped in the waste they toiled beneath. And as the walls tightened around me, dripping with unseen moisture and echoing with distant clangs and wet murmurs that seeped up through the floor, I felt something inside myself begin to shift, to fracture, to yield beneath the stench that pressed into my lungs with every breath. And in that slow suffocation, I understood with weary certainty that the rot of the hive was not content to cling to my clothes or my skin. It was beginning to settle into my soul, marking me as something it intended to keep. From the moment I left the junction where the rot-heavy air clung to my lungs like a living bruise, I sensed the shift, not in the filth beneath the grates or the shadows along the walls, but in the machinery itself. For the drones and grinders and pressure pumps that usually lay dormant in these hours began to murmur with a strange, sleep-breaking unrest, their metal housings trembling with low tremors as though dreaming creatures stirred inside them. And as I walked deeper into the corridor, the steady hum of the hive's buried engines thickened into a rough, throaty growl that vibrated the floor beneath my boots, making each step feel like I was treading across the ribs of something vast and restless. The lamp in my hand flickered with uneasy spasms, the beam jittering across the rusted pipes overhead, catching glimpses of oily residue that dripped like congealed tears down the curved plating, each drop falling in slow, sticky intervals that left faint stains on the walkway. The kind of stains you didn't look at too long because the longer you stared, the more they resembled the seepage from a wound that had never quite healed, a wound the hive didn't bother hiding anymore. As I descended a narrow incline, the floor listing slightly beneath my weight, the sound of distant grinding rose abruptly from the depths, a sharp metallic shriek like teeth scraping against bone, followed by a deep mechanical shudder that made every bolt in the walls rattle in their sockets. And I froze, breath caught at the base of my throat, because no part of the sanitation grid was scheduled to activate at this hour. No auto grinder was meant to start without a direct override, and yet there it was. the unmistakable churn of hardened gears chewing through something too dense to be ordinary waste, the wet crunch of material being pulled down into spinning depths, and the soft, sickening thump of something heavy slipping further into the machine's hungry maw. I pressed myself against the nearest wall, hands trembling around the lamp's handle, and listened as the grinding grew louder, more frantic, as though the machine were straining against whatever it had swallowed. And for a brief, quiet moment between the shrieks of metal and the low rumble of overworked pistons, I thought I heard something else. A low, muffled groan, faint and suffocated. The kind of sound a throat makes when buried beneath a weight it can't push away. A sound so human it sent a cold ripple crawling up my spine, though I told myself it was only echo distortion, only machinery flexing under pressure, only my mind trying to give shape to the countless horrors whispered about these depths. Forcing myself forward, I approached the chamber where the auxiliary grinders rested, a place workers jokingly called the maw, though the humor had always felt too thin, too brittle. And as I neared the entrance, the heat intensified, thick waves of it rolling through the tunnel like the exhalations of some great metallic beast rousing from slumber, and the air shimmered with a faint haze that carried the acrid tang of burning waste and the sour scent of biotic rot, blending into a nauseating perfume that clung to the back of my throat until I could taste the metallic bitterness of scorched matter. The door to the chamber hung slightly open, its locking mechanism twitching with irregular spasms, clicking open and shut as though the machine itself couldn't decide whether to fully reveal what waited inside. And when I pushed it gently with the toe of my boot, the door groaned inward, releasing a blast of hot, foul air that struck me like the breath of something ancient and starving. Inside, the great grinder pit glowed faintly from deep within, not with light but with heat, a ruddy, pulsing warmth radiating up through the grated floor, and the machinery that framed the pit shuddered with slow, uneven convulsions, its massive teeth grinding together in sluggish rotations that sent sparks arcing off into the darkness, each spark momentarily illuminating the thick sludge coating the walls, sludge that quivered in a way I had never seen waste move, quivering as though reacting to the heat, or to my presence, or perhaps to something deeper within the pit itself. I stepped closer, gripping the railing with fingers beginning to numb from the oppressive heat, and I watched the grinders as they churned, slowly dragging something through their teeth, a tangled mass of rags and organic matter that twisted in their grip, strained against the rotation, and then buckled inward with a wet collapse that sent up a burst of steam, the vapor swirling with a faint reddish tint that made my stomach clench with quiet certainty about what had just been consumed. My lamp flickered violently then, and for a heartbeat the chamber went dark except for the faint glow rising from the pit. And in that small, suffocating moment of near darkness, I heard it, soft, almost gentle, the sound of metal sighing, as though the machine were exhaling in satisfaction, its gears settling with a contented hum that felt horrifyingly alive, as though the grinders had been roused from slumber and now recognized me, acknowledged me, remembered me. When the lamp buzzed back to life, its beam shivered across the railing and landed on a set of old warning pictograms that had been half buried beneath grime, and though the symbols were faded, I could still make out the message etched beneath them in trembling script. It wakes when hungry. It sleeps when fed. "Do not fall behind." And the words struck me with a cold, intimate terror because they didn't read like an official safety notice. They read like the final warning of someone who had learned the truth too late, someone who'd seen the grinder stir for reasons no logic could explain, someone who knew the machinery down here didn't simply break protocol or malfunction by error, but by will. I backed away from the pit slowly, each step measured, careful, quiet, and the machinery's rhythmic hum seemed to follow me, echoing through the chamber with a peculiar warmth that made the hair along my arms rise, as if the grinder had marked my presence, had tasted the scent of my fear, had drawn some small piece of me into its pattern of quiet hunger. When I slipped back into the corridor, the door groaning shut behind me with a slow, reluctant creak. The hum of the machine lingered in my bones, vibrating through my ribs like a warning or a promise. And as I walked deeper into the hive's throat, with the lamp trembling in my grip and the shadows leaning closer with each step, I understood with quiet dread that the machinery down here was no longer pretending to be dormant, no longer feigning disuse or waiting for scheduled activation. For the grinders were awake, aware and hungry, and now that I had heard them stir, the hive's mechanical heart would not let me forget that I, too, was something soft moving within its endless, trembling dark. From the moment I stepped beyond the grinder chamber and felt the corridor narrow around me like a tightening throat, I sensed the presence that had been lingering at the edges of my awareness since the moment I first descended. Something patient, something listening, something that moved not with the lumbering certainty of machinery, but with the slow, deliberate intent of a thing that had no need for form until the moment it wished to touch you. And as I walked with the lamp trembling in my grip, the darkness thickened ahead of me, pooling in the low grooves of the tunnel floor like congealed shadow, a darkness too heavy to belong merely to the absence of light. And in that dense quiet, I felt the filth itself lean closer, tasting my breath as if measuring the warmth of it, the life of it, deciding if I had walked far enough from the world above to be worth claiming. I moved cautiously, sweeping the beam of my lamp along the slick walls where streaks of rust mingled with something wetter, darker, and the faint sound of dripping echoed with a rhythm that suggested not randomness but a kind of slow, deliberate cadence, as though the tunnel were breathing, exhaling rot in long, patient sighs. And when I reached a section where the walkway dipped beneath a thick pipe cluster, the air grew colder, the kind of cold that settles not on the skin but inside the bones, the kind of cold that feels like it has hands. I crouched to duck beneath the pipes, and as my boot sank an inch into the slick layer of waste coating the metal grate, something shifted beneath me. Not the machinery tremor I had grown accustomed to, but something softer, something that yielded first, then pressed back. And before I could lift my foot, a thin ripple spread beneath the surface of the muck, moving outward with a slow, deliberate grace. And I felt a single, unmistakable pressure against the side of my boot. A touch, a brush, a testing fingertip dragging lightly along the seam of the leather, as though deciding whether I could be pulled through. My breath froze in my throat, my lamp trembling so violently the beam jumped in frantic arcs across the dripping walls, reflecting off rivulets of slime like tiny veins of dying light. And I stood perfectly still, feeling the cold seep up my leg from the point of contact, not painful, not urgent, but exploratory, like the way a child might trail its hand across the surface of a river to test the current. And the realization that something beneath the waist possessed enough awareness to examine me sent a cold shudder rising from the base of my spine. Slowly, carefully, I shifted my weight back, and the pressure around my boot changed, a tightening that did not fully grip but resisted release, as though whatever lived beneath the surface wished to keep me there, wished to understand me further, or perhaps simply wished to confirm that I could not easily slip away. And when I pulled again, harder this time, the thing beneath the muck let go with a soft, wet release, and the sudden absence of its touch made the world feel too empty, too quiet, as though withdrawing not out of fear but anticipation, waiting for the next moment to reach back. I backed up a single step, heart thundering in a shallow rhythm that did not match the hive's deep mechanical pulse, and as I lifted the lamp higher, the beam caught something floating just ahead, a small cluster of threads rising from the sludge, pale and stringy, moving in the slight stir of air created by my own breath. And for a moment I convinced myself it was nothing more than decomposing cloth or the fibrous remains of some long-decayed machinery. But then the threads twitched in a way no lifeless thing should, bending toward the warmth of the lamp, curling like tiny feelers reaching for the light, and I recoiled, nearly stumbling as the walkway creaked beneath my shifting weight. The filaments sank slowly back beneath the muck with a soft ripple, and a moment later the sludge stilled, returning to its deceptively calm surface, though the faint echo of their motion lingered in my mind with the same weight as a whispered warning. Forcing myself forward was an act of will I barely possessed, each step carrying the dread certainty that the thing below could reach again, could test my ankle, my calf, the soft points behind my knee where bone thins to vein, and the lamp felt suddenly small in my hand, its light absorbed by the thick shadows ahead, as though the darkness itself were swallowing each beam the moment it left the glass. As I approached a turn in the corridor, the floor dipped again, forming a shallow basin where waste had pooled into a murky puddle that stretched across the entire walkway, its surface trembling with faint rings that rippled outward in slow, patient circles. Though no drip fell, no breeze stirred, and I knew with a sinking heaviness that if I crossed it, the thing, or its kin, would feel me again. I hesitated, gripping the cold rail beside me, and the hive groaned overhead in a long, shuddering exhale, as though urging me onward, and in that moment the puddle's center bulged upward ever so slightly, as if something beneath it pressed a palm, or something shaped like one, against the surface, the thin film of waste stretching in a soft dome before settling again, and the breath I inhaled tasted like rust and fear. But there was no other route, not in a place where the tunnels twisted with the logic of hunger rather than design, and so I stepped forward, my foot touching the cooling surface of the metal grate concealed beneath the slime, and at once I felt it, the unmistakable slide of something soft curling around my ankle, not fully gripping, only tracing the lines of my bones through the fabric of my boot, exploring the shape of me with a slow, reverent curiosity that made nausea coil in my stomach. And before I could react, a second touch joined the first, brushing the side of my calf, then a third higher still, and the muck vibrated in a faint, tremulous rhythm as though the thing beneath had begun to breathe faster or closer. And when one of the touches lingered, pressing just firmly enough to test the strength of the flesh beneath the boot's leather, I felt a quiet sound rise through the tunnel, not a growl, not a whisper, but something like a contented sigh sliding through liquid. And the realization struck me that the thing below was not reaching in hunger. It was reaching in recognition, acknowledging me the way a blind creature might greet a familiar presence in a long-forgotten darkness. I tore my leg free with a panicked step, nearly slipping as I scrambled onto dry metal, and the touches fell away at once, vanishing beneath the surface with a ripple that widened slowly, calmly, as though amused by my fright, as though confident that this first contact was only the beginning, and that the next time I walked these depths, whether tomorrow or in a month or in the final hour of my service, it would reach with more certainty, no longer testing but claiming, no longer brushing but holding, no longer curious but hungry. And as I stood trembling in the dim tunnel, the stench swirling around me like warm breath and the shadows tightening with quiet anticipation, I understood with a sinking, soul-deep dread that in the hive's endless throat there were things born of rot and forgotten grief that longed for the heat of a living body. And now that one of them had touched me, felt me, memorized me, it would never forget the shape of what it wanted. From the moment I tore myself free of whatever lingered beneath the sludge, stumbling onto the dry metal with a breath that shuddered through my ribs like a snapped wire, I felt the tunnels change around me, as though the hive itself had drawn a slow, deliberate inhale after watching the thing beneath the waste brush against my skin, as though it had been waiting for that first contact before revealing the truth of what lived deeper within its bowels. And as I pressed on through the narrowing corridor, each step trembling but unavoidable, the air thickened with a heaviness that went beyond stench or rot or the oppressive humidity of the lower districts. It felt like sorrow, old and heavy, a dense fog of grief that clung to my lungs and made every breath feel borrowed, as if the hive were choking me lightly with memories that were not my own. The walkway sloped downward and widened suddenly into a massive chamber where pipes jutted from the walls like broken ribs, dripping thick threads of dark sludge into a reeking reservoir below, and the faint glow from my lamp revealed clusters of shapes huddled between the pipes, misshapen silhouettes slumped against the walls, their bodies slouched in positions too still to be alive, yet too arranged to be discarded waste. And as I drew closer, the shadows did not recoil or shift, but seemed to lean subtly toward my light, drinking in its warmth like starving creatures inhaling the scent of food. I raised the lamp higher, and the glow crept across the nearest figure, illuminating a worker's uniform soaked with filth and stiff with dried residue. The fabric stretched over bones that jutted sharply beneath thinning skin, and though the body was undeniably dead, its head tilted at a strange angle toward me. The sockets where eyes had once rested filled now with a soft, pulsing sheen of moisture that reflected the light in a way that made it seem as though the corpse was staring straight at me, acknowledging me, remembering me. I staggered back, bile rising at the back of my throat, but behind that surge of disgust was something else, an inexplicable feeling of recognition, as though I had seen this man before, walked past him in a corridor above, heard him laugh softly during a late shift, yet no name came to me, no memory formed fully, only the haunting certainty that he had once been real and alive, and working the same endless cycle I now trudged through, and something inside me tightened with the quiet dread that these corpses, These slumped forms huddled in the dim recesses of the chamber were not merely bodies. They were workers swallowed by the hive, people whose disappearances had been shrugs on maintenance reports, whose names had been muttered once before being forgotten, their remains gathering down here like mourners clinging together against the cold. As I moved further into the chamber, the beam of the lamp trembled across more shapes, some half sunken into the sludge, some hanging limply from tangled cables like marionettes abandoned mid-play. Their fingers curled inward as if they had reached for something in their final moments, and others were little more than mummified remnants pressed against the walls where moisture and rot had fused them into the metal, their faces warped into overgrown masks of dried sorrow, each one seeming to whisper its silent testimony into the stale air. The machinery overhead groaned with a long, shuddering exhale, and a thin spray of condensation rained down onto my shoulders, warm and foul, carrying with it the metallic tang of old blood and the sour rot of decomposing flesh. And as the droplets slid down my back, I felt the same chill I had felt when the thing beneath the sludge touched me. Only now the chill ran deeper, coiling into the hollow behind my heart, as if the dead themselves were reaching through the moisture, brushing their cold memory against my living skin. I stepped carefully between the bodies, the metal grate groaning beneath my boots, and the chamber seemed to pulse around me in a slow rhythm, the shadows deepening with each pulse as though a presence stirred beneath the waste, beneath the machinery, beneath the graveyard of forgotten workers. And as I knelt beside one of the slumped figures, partly out of duty, partly out of a warped, fearful curiosity, the lamp cast a faint shimmer across their exposed cheek, revealing a thin line carved into the skin. A mark made not by a blade but by time itself, etched with precision into a pattern that resembled not scars but symbols, faint sigils drawn by the path of dripping rot as it slid down their face again and again over countless cycles, marking them as a permanent part of this place. I reached out, God's help me, I reached out, and my fingertips brushed the edge of that carved pattern, expecting the cold stiffness of decayed flesh. But instead the skin gave slightly under my touch, soft and pliant like wet cloth, and I recoiled instantly, nearly dropping the lamp as the corpse's head sagged further, collapsing inward with a quiet, sickening sound that echoed through the chamber like the whimper of a wounded animal. The shadows stirred then, not dramatically, not with any sudden lurch, but with a slow, collective shift, as though every slumped body in the chamber leaned just a fraction of an inch closer, the air tightening with a strange, suffocating longing. And I felt the oppressive weight of their unseen gazes pressing against my shoulders, not hateful, not hungry, but pleading, quiet, desperate, as though the dead wished to be remembered for even a moment before the hive swallowed them completely. I stumbled backward, boots skidding across the slick grate, and nearly fell as one foot slipped toward the reservoir below, the sludge roiling with a sudden stir that sent ripples crashing softly against the metal supports, as if the thing beneath the waist had sensed my nearness, sensed my fear, sensed the trembling heat of my living blood and reached for it, rising through layers of rot and forgotten bodies like a serpent preparing to strike. The air grew warmer, thick with the sour scent of disturbed decay, and I forced myself away from the ledge, heart pounding in frantic staccato while the hum of machinery trembled in low, mournful unison. And as I reached the far end of the chamber, breath ragged and limbs trembling. I cast one last glance over my shoulder and saw, in the wavering lamplight, the faint, unmistakable motion of a corpse's hand slipping off the pipe it had rested on, not falling, not collapsing, but drifting downward as though lifted by a subtle, guiding influence, fingers dragging through the grime like someone reaching out toward a departing friend. And as the shadows pressed around that motion, swallowing it into their dense embrace, I realized with a hollow, soul-deep ache that here, in the hive's forgotten depths, the dead did not lie still. They gathered, waiting, listening, longing for the warmth of a life that barely remembered they had ever existed at all. From the moment I left the chamber of slumped corpses behind me, the tunnel ahead shifting in slow, nauseating pulses, as if the hive were breathing heavier now that I had witnessed its graveyard. I felt the air vibrate with a low, almost musical resonance, a sound too soft to be called singing, too mournful to be mistaken for machinery, drifting upward from the deeper channels where the waste pumps swallowed the filth of a billion lives. And as I descended the sloping corridor, the hum grew clearer, resolving into layered tones that wavered like voices carried through thick, stagnant water, each one trembling with the weight of sorrow that felt older than the hive itself. The heat rose with every step downward, curling around my ankles like feverish breath, thickening into a humidity so dense it clung to my clothes and soaked through my gloves, and the walls grew slicker, coated with streaks of rust mingled with a darker substance that smeared under my touch, warm and almost tacky like half-coagulated blood. And the further I went, the more the sound intensified, not louder, but closer, as though the voices inside the hum sensed the presence of someone who could still hear. Someone whose ears had not yet gone deaf from years of labor in the choking dark. The walkway opened into a massive pump chamber where pistons the size of cathedral pillars rose and fell in slow, ponderous strokes, each plunge sending a deep shudder through the floor that vibrated up my legs and into my bones, and the steady rhythm of the machinery beat in time with the layered humming that drifted through the space, blending into a single mournful cadence that made my chest tight, as if 1,000 unseen throats exhaled their grief directly into the hollow behind my sternum. I lifted the lamp, its trembling beam sweeping across the cavernous chamber, illuminating arches of rusted metal where condensation dripped in slow intervals, each drop falling with a metallic note that seemed to harmonize with the low voices below. And for a heartbeat, I allowed myself the comforting lie that the hum was merely the sound of malfunctioning rotors echoing through narrow pipes. But then the pitch shifted, one voice quivering upward while another dipped lower, the dissonance threading through the air like a question whispered by unseen mouths. And I froze, every muscle locking as the sound curled around me like gentle fingers tracing the outline of my throat. I stepped toward the railing that encircled the pump pit, my breath shallow as I looked down into the churning darkness below, where thick, tar-like waves of waste were drawn into the massive intake vents, their suction creating slow, spiraling vortexes that dragged down everything floating on the surface. And in the dim lamplight, I saw shapes drifting in those currents. Limbs, cloth, fragments of machinery, and the pale, smooth curve of something unmistakably human, though too distorted by the current to retain its full shape. And as the waves pulled the debris downward, the humming grew clearer still, emanating not from the machinery but from beneath it, from the dark recesses where the hive's waste disappeared entirely, and the voices rose in mournful unison like a choir of souls trapped between exhale and silence. Leaning over the railing, I felt a faint draft rising from the pit, not warm like steam, but cool, almost gentle, brushing against my sweat-soaked face with the same soft pressure as a hand offering comfort. And beneath that breeze was the unmistakable scent of old stone, dust, and incense, as if the air that rose from the depths carried with it remnants of prayer left over from forgotten centuries. And when the next piston plunged downward with a thunderous shudder, the hum rose in response. The voices vibrating with a sorrow so pure it felt like a lamentation for every worker who had ever been swallowed by these depths. I whispered a curse under my breath, not out of blasphemy, but out of terror. For I knew then the impossible truth the older workers had always hinted at in trembling jokes and half-spoken warnings. The hive did not simply digest its dead. It remembered them, layered their last breaths into the endless hum of its machinery, trapping their voices in the spaces between rotating gears and flooded pipes, weaving their grief into the soundscape of its eternal labor. Stepping away from the railing, I followed the narrow walkway that circled the pit, each step accompanied by the soft vibration of the voices rising and falling in mournful harmony. And as I passed beneath a set of low, trembling pipes, a thin stream of condensation dripped onto my shoulder, warm and faintly sticky, soaking into the collar of my suit, and the touch of that moisture felt almost intentional, as though something unseen reached down with delicate fingertips to mark me, to press its presence into my skin, so the hive would know me even in complete darkness. Further along, I came to a graded platform jutting over a smaller intake channel where the waste flowed more violently, whipped into frothing motion by the powerful suction beneath. And as I stepped onto the platform, the humming surged upward in a swell of sound that made my knees weaken. For beneath the mechanical roar, beneath the gurgling of churned filth, beneath the heavy pumps grinding in their tireless rhythm, I heard distinct words, or something like them, soft syllables stretched thin with despair. A language I did not know but somehow felt in my bones like a memory rising from deep water. And though I could not decipher the meaning, the emotion pressed into each murmur reached me with painful clarity. Longing, grief, hunger, and an aching loneliness that resonated with the darkest corners of my mind. The grate beneath my boots vibrated in the same rhythm as the voices, and I felt the metal grow warm, then warmer still, until the heat forced me to step back. And as I staggered away from the platform, the hum dipped into a deep, trembling note that made the walls shudder and a spray of foul mist rise from the pit, coating my hands with a thin film of something that smelled like rusted tears and decayed memories. Wiping my palms on my uniform did nothing to remove the sensation, and I found myself trembling, not from fear of the filth or the machinery, but from the quiet, horrifying certainty that the voices below had recognized me, that the sorrow echoing through their layered tones was no longer impersonal, no longer lost in the mechanical flow of the hive, but directed at me with mournful intent, as if they saw in me the shape of someone they longed to pull beneath with them. As I hurried toward the far exit, the voices followed, rising in a collective swell that vibrated through the metal floor, through my bones, through the fragile shell of my remaining sanity. and the hum resolved into something like a word, one single, elongated syllable that carried my breath within it, shaped itself around my presence, echoing through the chamber like the whisper of a name I did not remember giving. And in that final moment before I escaped the pump room, my lamp flickered and dimmed, and the shadows beneath the churning waste shifted in a slow, unified ripple, as though the choir below had lifted their heads in solemn unison to watch me leave, their voices drifting upward in a final tremor of longing that felt less like a warning and more like a promise that no one who heard their song ever truly left the hive's embrace. From the moment I staggered out of the pump chamber, the lingering vibration of that sorrowful hum still trembling inside my ribs like a second heartbeat, I sensed the change, not in the stench or the heat or the weight of the air, but in the way the entire corridor seemed to watch me, as though the hive had exhaled its long, mournful song through the throats of the dead and now waited, listening, expecting my next breath to fall into rhythm with its own. And as I walked forward, lamp trembling faintly in my sweat-slick hand, the walls pulsed with a subtle warmth, expanding ever so slightly before contracting again, a slow, rhythmic motion that matched the cadence of the pump room chant, and I felt a cold tremor coil deep inside my stomach as the unmistakable truth sharpened in my awareness like a blade slipping through cloth. The hive was breathing. At first I told myself it was merely the pulse of machinery, the push and pull of pressure systems adjusting in the pipes overhead. But as I pressed my palm cautiously against the nearest wall, bracing myself as the tunnel sloped gently downward, I felt a warmth beneath the metal that had no mechanical explanation. Warmth like skin heated by exertion, by blood, by life. And beneath that warmth was a faint, pulsing rhythm, too irregular to be the beat of pistons, too organic to be the flow of coolant lines, a pulse that quickened subtly beneath my touch as though reacting to my presence. And I snatched my hand away, heart slamming against my ribs in a panicked rhythm that suddenly felt far too fast compared to the slow, patient pulse echoing through the hive's structure. Moving forward felt like walking deeper into the waiting throat of some impossibly vast creature, each step eliciting a faint tremor from the floor, not outward but inward, the vibration drawn toward me as though the hive were adjusting itself around my movement, aligning its countless arteries of pipe and cable to guide me where it wanted me to go. And when I reached a junction where 3 paths opened in yawning dark, the lamp flickered violently, its beam jittering across the walls before steadying on the center corridor, just as a faint shudder ran along the metal beneath my feet, subtle but unmistakable, like a nudge, a suggestion, a breath urging me forward. And though every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to climb upward toward the world of light and breathable air, I felt the same slow compulsion that guides a dreamer deeper into a nightmare, not from fear, but from the suffocating knowledge that the dream had already claimed them. I followed the center path, the tunnel sloping further until the air thinned into something denser, stickier, heavy with the scent of rusted iron and old sweat, and the condensation dripping from the pipes above hit my shoulders with a warmth too close to body temperature, as if the hive's hidden veins were sweating in the oppressive stillness, and the liquid streaked down my back like the touch of a hand dragging its fingers along my spine, making my breath hitch in my throat. The deeper I went, the more the subtle rhythmic pulse of the hive grew into something undeniable, a low tremor rolling along the walls in waves that brushed against my skin, with the persistence of a heartbeat pressed too close to my ear. And for a terrifying moment, I felt my own pulse begin to sync with it, each beat slipping into alignment with that slow, endless rhythm, until the boundary between my living body and the hive's vast, unseen lung began to thin. Suddenly the floor beneath me dipped, and I stumbled into a wider chamber where thick cables hung from the ceiling like tendons, swaying gently as though stirred by breath rather than by the stagnant air. And the sound within this space was softer than the pump room's mournful choir, quieter but more intimate. A wet, rhythmic thrum like the slow contraction of a massive, unseen muscle, each pulse sending a faint vibration through the grating beneath my boots. And as I approached the center of the room, my lamp flickered again, dimming until only a faint halo remained, revealing just enough to see the shapes fused into the walls. Human forms half submerged in metal like insects trapped in amber, their faces stretched in silent anguish or frozen in expressions of exhausted surrender, and their ribcage rose and fell in the dim light with a slow, unnatural rhythm, as though drawing breath not for themselves, but for the hive, inhaling and exhaling in long, synchronized waves that blended seamlessly with the hive's own tremor. My breath caught as I leaned closer to one of the forms, my lamp revealing the faint flutter of eyelids beneath a thin layer of translucent grime. And though the face was slack and ashen, I could swear I saw the faintest tremor ripple across the lips, like the ghost of a word struggling to surface through the suffocating embrace of metal and rot. And I staggered backward, a strangled whisper escaping my throat as the chamber pulsed around me in a long, slow exhale. Warm air brushing against my face like the breath of something impossibly vast. I fled toward the exit, but the tunnel warped subtly as I moved, the walls narrowing, curving inward with the gentle inevitability of closing hands, and the metal beneath my boots softened just slightly, enough that each step sank a fraction deeper than it should have, like walking across the chest of something half asleep, each footfall pressing into ribs that shifted beneath the weight. And I felt the hive respond to me, not with malice but with curiosity, with a slow, deliberate awareness that pressed against my thoughts like a whisper forming in the back of my skull. The hum of machinery faded behind me, replaced with the soft sound of something crawling through the walls, not mechanical but organic, the faint skitter of tendril-like motion weaving through the hollow spaces behind the metal as though the hive were adjusting itself to follow me, its countless hidden limbs shifting into place the way muscles align to cradle something fragile. I pressed onward, because what else was there but forward now? And as the tunnel opened into a low passage where the air grew thready and thin, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A single, soft inhalation drawn not by me, but by the tunnel itself. A long, slow breath pulled through unseen vents like the hive was tasting the air around me, sampling the warmth I still carried, savoring the fleeting vitality of a body that had not yet been claimed. And in that moment, with the darkness tightening behind me and the pulse of the hive drumming gently beneath my feet, I understood with a clarity so sharp it felt like pain that I was no longer merely walking through the hive. I was walking into it, into its hunger, its memory, its living, breathing vastness. And the hive was no longer a place I worked. It had become a creature that had noticed me, marked me, and now watched with quiet, patient intent as I stepped deeper into the embrace of its endless, trembling dark. From the moment I felt the hive's breath slip across my skin, warm, damp, almost tender in the way rot can be tender when it has waited long enough, I sensed the change in the air, not abrupt, not violent, but subtle, a shift in pressure like a hand settling over my shoulder, guiding without force, claiming without needing to speak. And as I descended into the next corridor, the stench that once simply clung to me began to wrap around my body with slow, deliberate intention, settling into the folds of my clothes, threading beneath my collar, seeping against the nape of my neck as though it were choosing the exact shape of me it wanted to keep. The light from my lamp dimmed again, its weak beam carving only a narrow slice through the thickened dark, and the shadows tightened around that sliver as if reluctant to let it pass, as though the very grime in the air had grown heavy enough to compress light itself. And I felt the floor beneath my boots shift in a way that was no longer subtle, less the trembling of machinery, more the slow flex of something living preparing to rise. Ahead, the tunnel dipped into a shallow trough where layers of waste had pooled into a murky expanse, thick as coagulated blood, its surface quivering in faint ripples that did not match the rhythm of my footsteps. And as I approached, the air grew warmer, the scent of rot intensifying into something sharp and metallic that stung the back of my throat. And I knew before the first ripple broke what waited beneath the sludge. Knew it not with logic, but with the instinct of a creature being hunted by patience rather than speed. But there was no other path, no ladder up, no maintenance hatch I could pry open, only the trough stretching across the entire corridor like a patient mouth waiting to be fed. And as I stepped into it, the foul liquid closed over my boots, then my ankles, clinging with a weight that felt less like fluid and more like hands gripping from below, fingers of rot threading between the seams of my uniform, smoothing themselves against my skin through layers of fabric, as if memorizing the warmth of my living flesh. I tried to move quickly, but the sludge resisted, thick currents swirling around my legs with a guidance too deliberate to be natural, pulling gently. Not enough to drag me under, not yet, but enough to remind me that my pace was not entirely my own anymore. And as I lifted one foot free with a wet, sucking sound, I felt something soft brush my calf through the filth, a caress so slow, so exploratory, that nausea climbed my throat with the sharpness of swallowed metal. I staggered, nearly dropping my lamp, and the moment the beam dipped low, the surface of the waste shifted again, this time with purpose, and a pale shape rose for a heartbeat from the depths, a smooth, rounded form like a knuckle or the top of a skull, pushing upward just enough to break the film of grime before sinking again with a languid roll that sent a warm wave washing against my shins. The contact felt intimate, almost affectionate, and the warmth of that rising shape lingered against my skin even after it disappeared. A heat that felt foreign to the hive's cold metal, but familiar in the way breath is familiar, expanding and fading in a slow rhythm that suggested the thing beneath the sludge was no longer testing me. It was reaching for me. I pushed forward, breath trembling, legs shaking as the sludge pulled again, this time a fraction more firmly, guiding me toward the far end of the trough with an insistence that felt like being led by the wrist through a crowd. And the shadows along the tunnel wall rippled quietly as though watching, waiting, anticipating the moment when the filth would no longer need to coax me step by step. Halfway across, my foot struck something solid beneath the surface, round, smooth, and disturbingly warm. And as I shifted my weight, the object rolled slightly, brushing the side of my ankle with a pressure unmistakable in its intent. And when I pulled my foot up, the sludge parted in thin strands, revealing for the briefest heartbeat the curve of a human jawbone fused into a mass of congealed waste. Eyes long gone, mouth stretched in a silent, gentle smile, as if welcoming me into the filth that had claimed it. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, but the sludge reacted instantly, tightening around my legs with a sudden, viscous firmness like arms wrapping around a waist, not crushing but holding, guiding me downward in a slow, deliberate pull that sent panic lancing through my chest as the warm filth rose to my knees, then my thighs, embracing me with a softness that felt far too intentional, and the scent of the waste shifted into something almost sweet beneath the rot, as though the hive itself were exhaling a scent meant to soothe prey before consumption. I strained against it, dragging myself forward with trembling arms toward the raised edge of the trough, the grating ahead slick with condensation, each movement slow and heavy as though the sludge whispered through my uniform, urging me to sink, to stop, to let it take the weight of my trembling body into its warm, waiting dark. And for a moment, one horrifying, breathless moment, I felt the temptation of it, the pull of collapse, the quiet promise that if I let myself fall, the filth would cradle me gently as it dragged me down, smothering my fear beneath the suffocating warmth of rot. But survival is often nothing more than a small, stubborn spark flaring in the dark, and I lunged forward with a shuddering gasp, fingers scraping against the raised grating until my nails bent painfully backward, and I pulled myself up with a hoarse cry, dragging my legs out of the clutching waste, the filth stretching in thick tendrils that clung to my skin before snapping with wet pops, splattering across the metal like dark, eager tongues. On dry ground, I collapsed to my knees, shaking uncontrollably as the sludge slowly stilled behind me, its surface smoothing into an eerie calm as though nothing had stirred within it, though the lingering warmth clinging to my thighs testified otherwise, sinking into my flesh like a memory that would not leave. As I struggled to stand, lamp flickering weakly, I felt the air tighten around me in a way I had felt only once before, during that first, testing touch beneath the walkway, and the shadows on the walls deepened into a slow, gentle ripple, as though the hive were drawing closer with quiet patience, recognizing that the filth had touched me more boldly this time, memorized more of my shape, learned the rhythm of my pulse, and now wanted more. And as I limped onward into the narrowing corridor, my legs trembling, my breath tight and sour, I knew with a dread that settled like iron in my bones that the filth had made its decision. It wanted me, not as waste, not as a corpse, but as something warm and moving and terrified that it could reach for again. And this time, when it chose to claim me fully, I knew it would not be gentle. From the moment I pulled myself free of the sludge's grasp and felt it slip from my legs with a sickening reluctance, as though the filth mourned the loss of my warmth, I knew with a trembling certainty that the hive had grown tired of merely testing me. For the tunnel ahead narrowed into a downward spiral carved not by human hands or industrial design, but by pressure, by weight, by something that had pushed its way through stone and metal with slow, patient hunger. And as I descended into that spiraling throat, the air grew cooler, denser, thick with the faint tang of iron and the quiet whisper of distant grinding echoing up from the unseen dark below. A sound that threaded through my bones with such familiarity it made my skin crawl, like the echo of the grinders I'd heard earlier, only deeper, slower, and far more deliberate. The walls tightened with each turn of the spiral, their slick surfaces reflecting the dim glow of my weakening lamp in warped, trembling streaks that looked disturbingly like veins pulsing beneath skin. And the faint tremor running through the metal felt less like the hum of machinery and more like the slow, methodical heartbeat of something vast and unseen, a pulse that quickened just slightly as I moved deeper, as though it sensed me drawing near. Soon the air grew so cramped the ceiling brushed the top of my helmet, and I had to stoop forward, my shoulders scraping patches of rust and congealed grime, each movement sending a cascade of dried flakes drifting down into the gloom ahead where the grinding grew louder. A thick, wet churn interspersed with low mechanical groans, as though something enormous labored in the darkness, chewing slowly on matter too dense, too stubborn, too alive to be easily consumed. The spiral ended abruptly at a graded platform perched above a vast chamber, so deep my lamp could not find its bottom, and the sight that greeted me stole the breath from my lungs. A yawning pit as wide as a manufactorum hall, its walls lined with ancient metal teeth the size of industrial loader claws, each one churning in slow, grinding motion, as though chewing endlessly on the slurry of waste and broken machinery that poured through countless pipes overhead. The sound was deafening yet strangely muffled, like hearing a monstrous breath through layers of cloth, and each rotation of the great grinders sent vibrations through the platform beneath my feet, making my knees wobble with each pulse, as though the chamber itself were swallowing the resonance of my bones. I approached the edge, the railing trembling beneath my grip, and saw the waste pouring down in thick, cascading sheets from above, sludge, broken machinery components, shattered crates, and sometimes shapes too humanoid to mistake, yet too mangled to fully recognize, all tumbling into the grinders where they vanished with slow inevitability, swallowed by a pit that seemed to digest everything with the patience of a creature that had never known hunger because it had never known scarcity. But it was not the machinery that froze me. No, it was the movement beneath the waste, subtle and rhythmic, shapes shifting in the slow churn like pale limbs reaching upward through the sludge before being pulled back down by the grinding teeth. And between the rotations, I caught glimpses of surfaces too smooth and curved to be scrap metal, too deliberate in their motion to be debris, as though the pit's contents were not merely swallowed but alive, stirring, reshaping, reaching for anything warm that approached the edge. A sudden wet crunch echoed from below, followed by a low groan of metal bending under pressure, and the grinders shuddered violently for a moment before resuming their slow chew, and something heavy disappeared into the depths with a long, dragging sound, like a body pulled across coarse metal before slipping into the maw. I staggered back from the railing, bile rising in my throat as the air thickened with the smell of hot oil, decayed matter, and something sweeter beneath it all, a scent disturbingly close to that of burnt marrow, and the realization struck me that this chamber was not simply a disposal site or a malfunctioning subsystem, but the hive's true stomach, a place where everything it consumed was broken down, ground into slurry, and fed back into its endless cycle of survival. I moved toward the narrow catwalk that stretched across the pit like a thin scar, its metal surface slick from condensation dripping from the pipes above, each droplet falling with a rhythm that seemed to anticipate my steps. And as I set foot upon the fragile walkway, the grinders below deepened their hum, the pitch shifting with a slow, predatory awareness that made my blood run cold, as if they recognized the presence of something they desired, something that did not belong to the lifeless refuse they normally consumed. Halfway across, the air grew warmer again, rising from the pit in waves of breath like heat, and the shadows at the edges of the walkway flickered with subtle motion, as though the chamber had begun to flex its unseen muscles around me, adjusting the tension of its vast, grinding teeth in anticipation, and the metal beneath my boots trembled with increasing frequency, shaking just enough to threaten my balance. I clutched the railing tightly, knuckles whitening beneath the grime, and forced myself forward toward the far end where a maintenance hatch glowed faintly beneath my lamp, its frame bent and warped but still intact, as though countless workers before me had fled into it only to vanish into the depths without ever returning, their absence unnoticed by those above who assumed they had simply fallen into the pit or fled their duties in cowardice. Behind me, the grinding deepened into a groaning resonance, and when I risked a glance over my shoulder, I saw a pale shape rising through the sludge, something curved, bulbous, the size of a human torso but lacking any recognizable anatomy, its surface rippling like flesh caught between states of decay and rebirth. And as it rose higher, the waist clinging to it peeled away in long, sticky strands, and beneath that coating was a texture I recognized instantly. Skin stretched taut over bone like ridges, pulsing faintly with a rhythm not entirely its own. The grinders shuddered again, their teeth parting in a slow, deliberate arc that revealed a deeper darkness beneath, a void that seemed to pull at the air around it, and the pale shape twitched as though encouraged by the machinery, drawn upward by some instinctual desire to escape, or to embrace the warmth of the one living soul foolish enough to wander this deep. Breath catching in my throat, I turned and ran, boots slipping on slick metal as the entire chamber vibrated with a new intensity, the grinders rotating faster now, the pitch of their hum rising into something that resembled a low, eager moan, and the heat of the pit blasted upward in thick waves as though the hive itself had inhaled deeply to pull me back. I reached the hatch and tore it open with a trembling hand, the hinges screaming in protest, and just as I squeezed through the narrow opening, I felt a warm spray against my leg, a splash of waste flung upward by the sudden convulsion of the sludge, and with it came a faint, unmistakable brush of something soft against the back of my calf, not a grip, not a pull, but a reminder, a gentle caress that seemed to say the hive had tasted me, touched me, remembered me. As I slammed the hatch shut behind me, the grinding below crescendoed in a deep, resonant groan that echoed through the shaft I now crouched within, and for the first time since my descent began, I felt the hive's hunger not as a distant threat, but as a presence rising behind me, patient and eager, knowing now the shape of what it wanted, and knowing that in these endless, trembling depths, there was nowhere left to escape its quiet, inevitable claim. From the moment the hatch clanged shut behind me, sealing the chamber's hunger on the other side of thin, trembling metal. I felt the silence close in, not the silence of safety, but the kind that settles over a place when something vast has paused its pursuit only because it knows the prey is trapped, knows there is nowhere left to run, knows that the next breath the prey draws will be among its final. And as I crouched in the narrow shaft, the air seemed to thicken into a palpable shape, warm and moist like the inside of a creature's throat, pressing gently against my cheeks, as though welcoming me deeper into its dark. The shaft sloped downward in a slow, claustrophobic descent, barely wide enough for me to crawl, my arms trembling as I dragged myself through the grime-slick passage, the filth coating the walls clinging to my skin like a second, suffocating layer. And with each movement, the sound of the grinders faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic vibration pulsing through the metal in soft waves that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat more perfectly with each passing moment. As though the hive were syncing its pulse to mine in preparation for the final act of consumption. The lamp flickered, its beam reduced to a faint, sickly glow that barely illuminated the rust-flaked metal ahead. And each time the light dimmed, the shadows in the shaft swelled forward, inching closer to my hands, my face, my breath, eager to take the places where the light faltered. And I could not shake the certainty that if the lamp died entirely, the dark would press into me with hands and memories and teeth I could not fight. Further down, the shaft widened into a cramped cavity, the ceiling low enough that I had to bow my head, and the air here grew warmer, damp with a humidity that beaded on my brow and gathered beneath my collar, trickling down my spine like sweat or tears or the slow exhale of the hive brushing against my skin. And when I raised the lamp, I saw the walls glistening with a thin film of dark moisture that swirled in slow patterns, moving independently of gravity, curling toward the heat of my hand as though alive. I pressed onward, each breath a soft rasp dragging rot-flavored air through lungs that trembled with exhaustion, and the shaft widened further still, opening into a cavern illuminated by no light of mine but by a faint, pulsing glow emanating from the far end, a soft yellow radiance that throbbed gently, rhythmically, the way a heartbeat might pulse through translucent flesh. And as I stepped toward it, my breath hitched, because I recognized the glow, the precise tint of it, the weary, flickering consistency of lumen strips powered by dying generators. And I realized with a hollow ache that I had reached the deep, waste-lit chambers where sanitation workers sometimes disappeared, the ones whose names were scrawled on faded wall plaques above ground as lost in service, the ones who had walked too far and heard too much and felt the hive's breath touch them the way it touched me now. The glow emanated from a half-collapsed corridor whose walls bowed inward like ribs protecting a heart, and within that corridor, the air shimmered with heat, rising in faint waves that distorted the grimy metal ahead, blurring it into a shape that resembled an open mouth exhaling warm, rancid breath into the cavern. And I knew with a quiet, weary certainty that this was the hive's final throat, the chamber where the forgotten dead were taken when they wandered too far, the place where the hive fed not on waste or machinery, but on the slow, soft warmth of those who had given their bodies to its darkness. I approached the mouth of the corridor, every step trembling with exhaustion, fear, and an odd, growing calm. And as I passed through the threshold, the warm air wrapped around me like gentle arms, pressing lightly against my shoulders, my chest, my throat, guiding me deeper with the tenderness of a mother cradling a child who has cried too long. And the rhythmic pulse of the hive throbbed beneath the floor in a slow, soothing cadence that slowed my breath until each inhale felt like sinking into warm water. The corridor narrowed again, funneling me toward a final chamber where the glow brightened into a soft, golden haze. And when I stepped inside, I found it filled with shapes, dozens of them slumped against the walls, seated along the floor, half sunken into the metal that had softened around them like warm wax, their bodies held in gentle repose, their eyes half closed, their lips parted in expressions of relief so raw and unguarded that it took me a long moment to realize these were the missing workers. The ones who had vanished over the years, the ones no one above had mourned because the hive never returned their bodies. Yet they were not corpses, not entirely, for their chests rose and fell in shallow, synchronized breaths, each inhale soft and trembling, each exhale warm and slow, their bodies alive only in the most fragile, tenuous sense, as though the hive preserved them in the liminal space between living and dissolving, harvesting their final, flickering warmth in the same patient manner. A candle draws the last light from its wick. I stepped toward one, a woman whose name hovered on the edge of my memory, and as I reached out to touch her cheek, my fingers brushed her skin and felt it give slightly, warm as flesh warmed by fever, and her eyes fluttered open, just barely, revealing pupils clouded with silent surrender, and she exhaled a soft breath against my hand, a breath that carried no fear, only weary gratitude, as though relieved that someone had come at last to join her in the quiet dark she had endured for so long. The hive hummed around us, the pulse deepening into a low, soothing croon that vibrated through my bones, and the warmth of the chamber seeped into my limbs, easing the ache in my muscles, dulling the sharp edge of fear until it felt distant, irrelevant, like a memory belonging to a life I no longer needed. And I lowered myself beside the woman, sinking onto the softened metal that cradled my weight with slow, careful pressure, molding itself around my body the way warm wax molds around a cooling blade. Holding me, supporting me, claiming me without force, the warmth rose through me in slow waves, filling the hollow behind my ribs, softening the trembling of my breath, quieting the frantic pulse in my throat until my heartbeat slipped into rhythm with the hive's own slow pulse. And as my eyelids grew heavy, I felt the soft brush of something beneath the floor, filth, rot, memory, or perhaps the hive's unseen tendrils, touch my back with the gentleness of a parent laying a child to rest. In that final slow moment, the stench faded into something warm and almost sweet. The darkness thinned into a comforting haze, and the quiet hum of the hive settled around me like a lullaby whispered from a great, unseen mouth, guiding me toward stillness, toward silence, toward the fate of all who had walked too deeply into its throat and been held by its endless hunger. And as the last thin thread of my fear unraveled into the warmth, I exhaled a breath that rose softly into the hive's waiting dark, offering it whatever flicker of life remained in me. And in that trembling release, I felt, not pain, not terror, but the quiet peace of being remembered at last by something vast enough to hold even the smallest, most forgotten soul. And as the golden haze dimmed into gentle black, a final thought drifted through me like a fading prayer. Emperor, let this be enough.